When a government that has built its foreign policy identity around unwavering support for Ukraine finds itself defending fuel licensing decisions that opponents characterize as quietly softening the economic pressure on Moscow, the resulting political storm is not simply a communications problem. It is a test of whether principle and pragmatism can coexist in the same policy framework without one destroying the credibility of the other. Subscribe for more analysis. Here we don't sugarcoat, we expose what others are afraid to say. The sequence of events surrounding Britain's Russian oil sanctions this week carries a complexity that the political noise around it has consistently flattened, and understanding what actually happened, as opposed to how it has been framed by competing political interests, requires holding several contradictory realities in view at the same time. The British government announces what it describes as a strong new package of sanctions on Russia, measures it claims go further than anything previously implemented, including new bans on maritime services relating to liquefied natural gas and new prohibitions on refined oil products of Russian origin. That is the headline the government wanted. Significant what emerged alongside it, and what rapidly consumed the headline entirely, was the simultaneous issuance of two targeted short-term licenses permitting the import of fuel that has been refined abroad from Russian crude. The licenses exist because a structural loophole in Britain's existing sanctions regime has, since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, allowed the country to import jet fuel and other oil products manufactured at third-country refineries using Russian crude as feedstock. Ministers had committed earlier this year to closing that loophole. The licenses represent a temporary pause on that closure, not a reversal of sanctions already in place, but a delay in implementing the tightening that had been publicly promised. The distinction matters enormously, and the government's failure to communicate it clearly is what creates the political opening that the Conservatives immediately exploit. At Prime Minister's questions, Kemi Badenoch frames the licenses as a watering down of existing sanctions, a characterization that Starmer contests directly and with evident frustration. Measuredly, he argues that what the government has announced represents new sanctions being phased in through standard transitional mechanisms, the same technique, he notes, that the previous Conservative government employed when it introduced its own sanctions packages. The phasing argument is technically coherent. Sanctions of this kind, when applied to deeply integrated energy supply chains affecting consumer fuel prices, do not function well as overnight switches. Businesses need transition periods, refineries need alternative supply arrangements, consumers need protection from price shocks that arrive faster than alternative supply chains can be established. The use of short-term licenses as a bridging mechanism is not novel, and Starmer is accurate when he describes it as standard practice. But accuracy and political effectiveness are different categories, and in this case the gap between them is wide enough to drive a significant reputational problem through. The reason Badenoch's attack finds traction even against a technically defensible policy position is that the government has created a perception problem through sequencing and communication. When ministers pledged to close the Russian oil loophole and then issued licenses that effectively kept it open for a defined period without clearly explaining the transitional rationale in advance, they handed the opposition a narrative that wrote itself. The appearance of a policy reversal, even when the underlying reality is more nuanced, carries its own political consequences, and in a week when Starmer is already managing internal Labour pressure from multiple directions, an appearance of retreating on Russia carries a particular kind of damage that goes beyond the specific policy debate. Business and Trade Minister Sir Chris Bryant's response during the urgent question on the licenses is notable for its honesty and simultaneously for the political cost that honesty carries. He acknowledges directly that the government handled the issue clumsily, accepts personal responsibility, and apologizes to members of the House. He states clearly that the intention is to strengthen the sanctions regime rather than weaken it, and reaffirms that the licenses will be as temporary as possible. It is, by the standards of ministerial accountability, a genuinely candid acknowledgement of failure, not policy failure, but communications failure, which in the current political environment is almost as consequential. The problem with Bryant's admission is that the government confirms the inability to translate a defensible policy into a clear public message, and in a media environment where the first framing of a story tends to dominate regardless of subsequent clarification, the damage from the initial narrative is not easily repaired by later accuracy. The geopolitical context in which all of this unfolds adds a layer of weight that purely domestic political calculations struggle to fully capture. Britain's relationship with Ukraine under Starmer has been one of the most consistently substantive commitments his government has made on the international stage. The image of Starmer and Volodymyr Zelensky embracing outside Downing Street following Donald Trump's confrontational White House meeting with the Ukrainian president is not a piece of political theatre. It is a statement of alignment at a moment when the coherence of Western support for Ukraine is under genuine pressure. Starmer has invested significant diplomatic capital in the Coalition of the Willing, the 34-nation grouping established to strengthen Ukraine's position, and that investment gives Britain's sanctions posture a symbolic importance that extends beyond energy policy into the broader question of whether democratic allies mean what they say when they commit to supporting a nation defending itself against invasion. That is why the Russian oil licenses controversy cuts deeper than a domestic political squabble over regulatory technicality. Every time a Western government's commitment to Ukraine-related sanctions appears to waver, even temporarily, even for legitimate transitional reasons, it provides a data point to those who argue that economic pressure on Russia is unsustainable and will eventually erode. The United States, which has itself extended a sanctions waiver allowing purchases of Russian seaborne oil to support energy-vulnerable countries affected by the Iran conflict, is navigating the same tension between principled sanctions posture and practical energy market realities. Britain's decision follows in that American context, which provides some geopolitical cover, but also demonstrates that the tension between sanctions idealism and energy economics is not uniquely British. It is a structural feature of the current global energy environment that every major Western economy is managing with varying degrees of transparency. What the Starmer government's handling of this episode reveals is a recurring pattern in its communications approach. Substantive policy decisions that are defensible on their merits are being consistently undermined by the gap between what is decided and how it is explained to the public and to Parliament. The decision to implement a phased transition into stronger sanctions is defensible. The failure to preemptively explain that transition in terms that anticipate the obvious opposition attack is a strategic communications failure that has now occurred often enough to constitute a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Starmer's personal record on Ukraine and Russia remains his strongest asset in this debate. He has not hesitated to confront the political costs of sustained military and financial support for Kiev, has maintained that position through significant domestic economic pressure, and has anchored Britain's European security posture at a moment when transatlantic reliability is in question. That record does not disappear because of a licensing controversy, but it is the backdrop against which the controversy is judged, and the expectations it creates are precisely what makes any apparent softening of the Russia position so politically combustible. The broader consequences of this week's events is a government that finds itself defending its Ukraine credentials that should, by any objective measure, be among its most secure against an attack that exploited not a genuine policy reversal, but a communication failure that allowed a reversal narrative to establish itself before the accurate framing could take hold. That is a peculiar kind of political vulnerability, one that speaks less to the government's values or its strategic direction and more to the persistent gap between between the quality of its decision-making and the quality of its public account of those decisions. Closing that gap is not simply a matter of better press releases or improved parliamentary handling. It requires a fundamental recalibration of how the government sequences its announcements, how it anticipates opposition attacks, and how it builds the explanatory architecture around complex policy decisions before those decisions enter the adversarial arena of Westminster and the 24-hour news cycle. Whether Starmer's government demonstrates that it has learnt that lesson in the weeks ahead will determine not just the political life of individual policies, but the broader credibility of a government that is on the substance of its governing record in a stronger position than its current political standing suggests.